And joining me now is Ioan Grillo, journalist and author of the book El Narco, but this time we're talking about his most recent publication, Blood, Gun, Money. Ioan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Great to be here.
So this is a very provocative book, if you don't mind me saying, about gun trafficking, which you address periodically is understudied and overlooked. But I'm curious, what exactly inspired this book?
So I've been covering the violence in Mexico for more than 20 years. First started reporting on Mexico in 2001. And in that time, I've covered, what initially was a lot of fun in some ways and glamorous, covering drug traffickers, these figures who are sung about in songs, who move cocaine, have these wild parties. But then I found myself covering a humanitarian crisis, things I couldn't have imagined. I mean, there was one of the worst thing I covered was 49 bodies that were dumped and all had their heads cut off, their hands cut off, their feet cut off. Firefights that lasted days, and tens of thousands of mothers and fathers looking for their children who had disappeared. So pretty a brutal conflict that I've covered in that time. And I'd seen the issue of guns for a long time, firearms, and where they're coming from, how are these firearms still moving. And for a long time, I thought, well, this is, it's an important issue, but what really can we say about this? America has the Second Amendment, that's where a lot of the guns come from. But then in 2017, I had the opportunity to interview a gun trafficker in prison in Ciudad Juarez, and was talking to him about how he trafficked guns from the United States to Mexico. And he was describing how he would do it with no paper trail at all, and the techniques he used. So I realized, well, there's quite a lot about this, actually. It's not really a question of, just America's right to bear arms and the Second Amendment. It's about why is the law not being enforced on cartels getting weapons, and can you still enforce the law while respecting the Second Amendment rights of Americans? So I got into this, began a journey of years investigating this and going right across from the murder scenes in Mexico, including the murder of an ICE agent in Mexico, an American ICE agent, looking at the guns used in that murder and tracing them right back to a factory in Romania being sold in the United States, and looking at why are cartels so easily able to get weapons. We're not talking about a few guns. We're talking about an estimate of more than 200,000 firearms a year being trafficked from the United States to Mexico to the most violent cartels. We've got 192,000 firearms which we know have been caught from these very violent criminals and traced directly to these gun shops and gun factories, and very, very brutal weapons. We're talking about like Barrett 50s, AK-47s, AR-15s, and these kind of guns. So why is that happening, and why is this laws not really being enforced on this? What's going wrong? How they so easily able to get these firearms?
Well, and you brought up a good point, and you make this abundantly clear in your book that you're not going against the Second Amendment. You're not questioning it. You're just saying, what you're not saying what some people might fear as the government should take away people's guns. But you do know that in some dangerous circles, there are some sort of gun control. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's interesting talking about the issue of gun control, gun rights, and stepping into this as a Brit who lives in Mexico. I'm from the UK originally, been in Mexico 20 years, seen a lot of gun violence here and also around Latin America and even in the United States. But going into America, and it's a very one of the sacred issues in the United States is the Second Amendment and gun rights. So I stepped into it with I tried to have a humility there and talk to everybody in this debate, from the president of the AR-15 owners of America to people in the Alaska Machine Gun Association, to people in militias, to everybody across this debate, to victims of gun crime and activists on all sides. So really getting to the issue of guns. So, within the United States, there's still rules around who can have guns and who can't have guns, even respecting the Second Amendment. You have the right to bear arms. So apart from a more kind of fringe element, most people agree that violent criminals should not be allowed to have guns, meaning that if somebody has already been convicted of a felony, they've gone to prison for for shooting somebody, and they come out, they shouldn't then be allowed to have a gun. Now, there's some people on certain fringe who say no, it's kind of more fundamentalist interpretation, they should have a gun. But most people say they shouldn't have guns if they've been already convicted of violent crimes. Other things, people generally agree that people shouldn't be allowed to have guns on airplanes. It sounds kind of funny, but like these are still limits that people agree there should be some limits with guns about where we can have them. Another thing is people don't believe that prisoners, if you're inside prison, should have a gun. Now that sounds funny, but I've been in prisons in Latin America where the prisoners have guns. I went to a prison in Honduras, in San Pedro Sula, Honduras, and they had the prisoners, as well as there being fighting dogs in the prison, and the prisoners had their like wives and girlfriends inside. They were sitting there with like Uzis, like
what?
In the prison here. It was crazy. And in this prison, the military was on the periphery on the outside, but once we were inside, we were like at the there was no guards with us. We were with the prisoners around us, and they even had grenades and stuff in there. When I was in that prison, the journalist I was with, a local journalist, Orlin Castro, a great guy, and I said to him, what should we do if they start fighting? Because they were having a beef with another gang controlling a different part of the prison. And he said, well, the best thing to do is probably hide under a bed.
Great.
and it didn't go off, but like about 5 days after I was in the prison, it went off, big firefight, and they went in there and took away loads of guns and grenades and all kinds of stuff from the prisoners. So anyway, so there are limits. Now, when you have, like in Latin America, and a lot of the work I've done with my trilogy of books and 20 years of journalism on this, is trying to understand what these organized crime groups are, what these cartels, gangs, commandos, posses, what they are, what they represent in Latin America and the Caribbean. And you see that there are forms of control, kind of paramilitary warlords, gangster warlords in these areas. So you see with them imposing their own gun control. And you see, for example, this group called the Gulf Clan, the Clan del Golfo in Colombia. They will. I talked to one of the gun traffickers there, who was involved in bringing some guns over the Darien Gap, actually south over the Darien Gap down to Colombia. And he was talking about that the Gulf Clan had the monopoly on selling guns inside this city. And so you couldn't really get a gun unless you were a Gulf Clan member or affiliate, or they said, okay, you're allowed to have a gun. So they exercised their own gun control or monopoly on violence in these cities. And you see that, with things like the Hells Angels,
the biker gang in Los Angeles.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So with in Blood Gun Money, I interview Cos, who's an ATF agent who goes undercover in 3 different biker gangs, the Bagos, the Warlocks, and the Mongols. He goes undercover in all 3, and he talks about when he's there, and they have levels of like, we've got a club here, and we're allowed to have guns, but other people are not allowed to have guns here. And certain, if you're just a hanger on, you're not allowed to have a gun, and then you're going to rise up, and we allow you to have firearms.
Right. If you're not a full member, you don't get to carry one.
Yeah.
Or they take your gun from you and hold on to it if you're going to come into a certain club or a room.
Yeah, exactly. So you see kind of rules around guns in different places. It's not as simple as that everybody has a firearm. It's interesting as well when you get into the US gun laws, you see this big variety. When you get deep into it, you get into the Second Amendment and the different interpretations of the Second Amendment, which then goes back, to British history and looking at the language they used in the Second Amendment and how that was actually used. I have to look at the kind of the Glorious Revolution in England to understand the language. And then you get to the different, the variety of different, laws and city laws and all things. And there's one town in Georgia where there's a city ordinance that it's illegal not to have a gun. You know,
Okay.
they don't really enforce this, but in theory, you've got to. And so, like, talking to this one militia guy from Michigan, and he was saying, well, his interpretation is that everybody is militia in the United States. Basically, you are, by being an American citizen, a militia man or a militia woman, a militia person, and you should take your duty to bear arms because of that. So it's actually a very, very broad interpretation. It's a big issue. And looking at all this, it's like, how can we try and stop some of these extremely violent cartels in Mexico who have committed hundreds of thousands of murders, who are destabilizing the country on the southern border of the United States, who are causing refugees to flee and ask for asylum in the United States, who are trafficking very venomous fentanyl, which is killing American citizens, who people are now will call them terrorist groups, and hit them with drone strikes. How do you stop these organizations having all of the firearms they want?
You brought up a good point, the fentanyl. I want to touch on that later, but before I forget, you mentioned your interview with the ATF agent, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. You spent close attention on this agency. What do you remember most from the time that you spent with them that you hope people will kind of take away from that, or maybe even pay close attention to on that?
So I think if you look at the United States, there's many paradoxes, I would say, about the United States when it comes to violence and crime. And one of them is that, we can get into the issues of, the United States has a murder rate that's very, very different from European countries. But then, maybe it's a bad comparison, something unfair comparison, trying to compare, the United States to Sweden, the United States to Belgium. It's just a very, very different country, different circumstances. But the United States does have a lot of gangs, a lot of very serious organized crime, the biggest drug market in the world, and by far the largest amount of firearms in civilian hands. The count now is more than 400 million firearms in civilian hands in the United States, more than the next 25 countries combined. At the same time, the United States has a very aggressive federal agency, which is attempting to deal with firearms crimes as well as kind of policing the firearms industry. So whereas you don't see that in most of the Latin American countries, even though they got terrible gun crime in Mexico, Brazil, Honduras, Jamaica, you don't really see this, bolstered multi-billion-dollar federal agency to target gun crime. So it does.
You call them the gun police in your book.
The gun police, yeah, and that's what some of the ATF agents say, the gun police. It's funny that the ATF, if you look at kind of popular culture, everyone knows the DEA and the kind of the narcs. They used to be called the kind of narcs. Everyone knows the FBI, the kind of the G-men, whatever. And the ATF, they don't really have that kind of popular image. And in fact, there's quite a big faction of Americans and gun owners who really dislike the ATF. Who are very, because they see them as infringing on the right to bear arms. And so you look at the history of the ATF, which, goes back a long time, but it really comes into its current form in 1968, when you really start to see the ATF become the kind of modern ATF. And then you see, this kind of kickback. And then you also see a radicalization of the NRA. The NRA, which is another paradox, which historically at the beginning was started by Civil War veterans from the northern side, including a New York Times journalist, was one of the fans of the NRA. Funny to think now, at the time it was about practicing straight shooting because the troops from the northern states couldn't shoot straight. And then the NRA, which is in favor of gun regulations in these various acts, 1934, 1968. And then it was in the 70s that it kind of radicalized and became very, very different and more at odds with the federal government. The ATF have been effective they've also lost more agents in the line of duty than other federal agencies. And they've been quite effective in hitting gun crime. And one of the things they really go for is what we talked about before is felons who have firearms. That's one of the easiest crimes they can prosecute. So you find somebody who's a convicted felon, and then you find they've got, 10 guns in their house.
Right.
They might be a gang member, they could be organized crime, mafia. They kind of go after the more violent criminals, and then they kind of find they've got guns. So they've been quite effective on hitting that. Interestingly, one of the groups they've gone after a lot, and maybe disproportionately, are biker gangs.
Okay. And why is that?
Well, one of the reasons, and it's kind of interesting, because if you look at like these different agencies, okay, the FBI are big mafia guys. A lot of the big mafia informants, so deep undercover in the FBI is within the mafia.
Yeah.
DA, it's kind of cartels. DA, when they've done stuff, they're cartels. And the ATF is biker gangs. Now, one of the reasons is who they have. The FBI, they've got quite a lot of like Italian American guys who can do the undercover work with the mafia. And then you've got obviously the Donnie Brasco's, the big, big landmark case.
Right.
The DEA has quite a lot of Hispanic, Mexican American guys who have done the work. Kiki Camarena, the most famous one. And we've done the work in ton of, with the cartels. And the ATF have a lot of regular white American guys who can do undercover. They want to do undercover. That's what agents want to do. So who can they infiltrate? And it's like biker gangs.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And we're seeing a lot of the undercover work is heavily relied upon, and there's so much to unpack in that in and of itself. How serious is, I'm pretty sure I already know the answer, but based on your own research and experience, how serious is the problem of gun trafficking in Texas or through Texas?
Yeah, so Texas is the biggest state for licensed firearm dealers in the United States, and is a huge state for trafficking guns to Mexico.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Through Texas and from Texas. If you look, Texas has got this huge border with Mexico. So the Texas border goes, and if you look in terms of the cartels, the Texas border goes, it goes to the Gulf of Mexico, so the Gulf Cartel. It goes up next to the Nuevo Laredo area, which is the Northeast Cartel, which is at war with the Gulf Cartel. The Gulf Cartel will always fight amongst themselves. And then you go on, and then you get to like Juarez El Paso area, which is the Juarez Cartel and the Sinaloa Cartel there. So Texas, you've got a border with 4 cartels on the Mexican side, and a huge amount of drug trafficking and a huge amount of gun trafficking. You look at so many of these cases. Now, the other major state, biggest state is Arizona, which is a major state for trafficking. The scene of Fast and Furious, which some of the listeners who are on this, they might be shouting out, Fast and Furious, Fast and Furious.
Fast 10 is coming out,
yeah. Fast and Furious, the scene of Fast and Furious was Arizona. But you had similar things and huge amounts, and it's from, you see sales of guns that go down to Mexico right across Texas. It can be Houston area, Dallas area. In the book I profiled, there's one gun trafficker who was going up every weekend to the Dallas area. I went to a big gun show in Mesquite, known as the gun show capital of America. But also Houston area and kind of small towns all over the place. You can see guns traffic from there to Mexico.
Well, see, and lately it seems like everyone's just been so focused on the drugs, fentanyl, as you mentioned earlier. And in Houston, Harris County, where I'm interviewing you from, the district attorney's office recently announced they would be creating a task force, a major narcotics task force, where they would be working with the local agencies, Houston Police Department, the Sheriff's Office, the DEA, and the FBI to combat or to target dealers, narcotics dealers, fentanyl dealers, and get them off the streets. Based on, in your opinion and based on your research, how do we balance these serious issues of drug trafficking and gun trafficking effectively and working to fix the problem? Because you kind of note in your book that it's not just about going after the dealers sometimes.
Yeah, so the bigger strategies. So when you look at the gun trade and the drug trade, I say these kind of like two venomous plants wrapped around each other.
Mm.
You can see these parallel but kind of working together. In terms of the drug, I mean, you've got basically what cops are doing, and cops right now are dealing with their laws and trying to deal with this epidemic of fentanyl. So you've got from that sense, they're hitting these dealers and these street dealers. Now, in terms of the biggest strategy about this, it's very hard, and I don't know that the easy answers of one button you can press to make this go away. There is, I did believe in marijuana legalization, as in, you take away the marijuana profits from these organizations, and make that legal. Although marijuana can be harmful, don't get me wrong, there can be harmful sides to marijuana, and mixing with schizophrenia and these kind of things. But with the harder drugs, I don't know the answer, and particularly with fentanyl, that's kind of made me think of what do we do about this. It's so venomous. There's so many people dying of this stuff.
Yeah, there's been new drugs that just keep popping up off the streets. There's Benadryl, even just over-the-counter medications.
Yeah, absolutely. So now in the short term, if they hit hard, and now they're talking about like things like homicide charges on fentanyl dealers. If somebody dies from your fentanyl, you get homicide charges.
Right.
So that's kind of hard. Now I don't know how much appetite people have for that. Like Americans have for that, for really like locking up people for these big sentences. But that could have an impact in the short term. But one of the problems we've seen in the long term, we've seen 50 years of the war on drugs, is that although you kind of hit this stuff hard, they keep on finding new ways of moving around this and change up tactics and so forth. So yeah, we've got to see, but like, I do agree, at least with the fact that fentanyl is a really serious problem. It needs to be talked about openly, and we need to report on this in the news. I mean, this is not a created hype. When you have 107,000 Americans dying in a year of overdose deaths, when you have 70,000 of those with fentanyl in their system, and now 30,000 with crystal meth in their system, certain overlap there, then this is very, very serious stuff. And the fact is, it is the Mexican cartels that bring this stuff into the United States. I mean, that's a fact.
Well, and I know in December of last year, the Houston DEA said that they seized enough fentanyl that could essentially kill the population of the greater Houston area. And if that's not frightening, I'm not sure what is. But this is also not to say that, some people would say that we should probably kind of tackle this at the source, which is, as you mentioned, the gun trafficking. Because people will, in your book, you note how people will use guns as bartering methods for drugs. Most recently, parents and families who lost loved ones in, Uvalde and Santa Fe, they went before the state capitol to urged, lawmakers to pass reform bills for gun control, like increasing the age from 18 to 21, as well as the putting a waiting period. What other steps can ordinary citizens take to help out?
Yeah, so you raised some a lot of interesting points there. So first, with the issue of, with guns and drugs, I do believe in reducing the harm of these things. And I'm a bit careful now because what they're doing on the West Coast of the United States, I don't necessarily agree with what's happening there. I don't really know super well, how things are playing out in Los Angeles and San Francisco. But the basic concept is we've got these problems of drugs and we've got problems from firearm violence. And we have to try and reduce the problems of this. Mm-hmm. So we've got to reduce gun murders and we've got to reduce drug overdose deaths.
Right.
This is practically what we've got to do. So when we say when we've got criminals, there's going to be criminals, but we've got to try and reduce the level of firearms they have and reduce their how confident they are about using these firearms in crimes. Now, the United States has done that to extent, just as a comparison with the United States compared to Mexico. In the United States, you don't really get a group of criminals driving around openly with AK-47s like they do in Mexico. Mm-hmm. You don't get them having Barrett 50s and firing at police vehicles and killing policemen like you do in Mexico quite as openly. So it's about trying to reduce them. The United States understood historically, you got to kind of hit these guys and kind of reduce the level of violence they can unleash on society. Now, getting over to, we talked about Uvalde mass shootings. Mm-hmm. So I have a chapter in my book on this and looking at mass shootings and also comparing this. And you see there's certain similarities here. I mean, you see some of the same type of firearms used. So the same, I profiled this gun used by a cartel in Mexico to kill an American agent in Mexico, Jaime Zapata, shot dead 2011 in San Luis Potosí. And that same firearm was used in the massacre in El Paso, the same type of firearm.
Wow.
Right, which is the same Waza 10 Kalashnikov. I'll go to the Kujir factory in Romania that comes from. So you see these kind of same types of firearms used. You see the same issue of innocent people being murdered. Obviously, in the United States, in El Paso and Uvalde, completely innocent people being killed. And in Mexico, many innocent people being murdered. In this, it's not only the bad guys being killed here. You get people carrying out massacres. You get, stray bullets. You get children killed. There was a 7-year-old killed last weekend when gunmen went into a water park in Mexico on the last Saturday of the Easter weekend to take out a rival, and they took him out and they killed the entire family. And they killed a 7-year-old boy.
Yeah. No, and as of this reporting, there's a cheerleader who was shot after accidentally getting in the wrong car in Elgin, Texas. And we pray that she's okay, but last, as of this reporting, she's still in the hospital. But this is, it's just getting crazier and crazier. And this is not going to be the first time you're talking about this, not just, in this interview. You're going to be doing an actual guest lecture at, I have it in front of me, the World Affairs Council of Houston on 3 consecutive days, Monday through Wednesday, the 24th through the 26th. Can you tell us what you'll be speaking about? Because you're not going to be speaking about the same thing.
Yeah, no, I believe it's Tuesday, the Tuesday and the Wednesday, but I believe there's 3 events over 2 days. Sure. So I've done a lot of stuff with the World Affairs Council. They're a great organization in Houston. I've talked there previously, and I've also gone with them to talk in local schools, which has been fascinating. I talked in high schools, different high schools, about cartels in Mexico, about gun violence, all this kind of stuff. Very interesting responses, from students there, about this stuff. But I've also, with them, I'll be talking about with different groups. So they have a young professionals, and they have the more senior crowd there. and yeah, talking about the cartels, the gun trafficking, the violence, the organizations, many things. I'll bring some, some slideshows and photos. So it's great to see anybody there. But just to finish your question previously, mentioned about what people can do. So the actual laws that I recommend, or measures that I recommend. So in the book, I keep this fairly focused on the issue of gun trafficking. I talk about this overlap with the mass shootings and these different things. There's a lot of debates in the United States, but I talk, focused about gun trafficking, but both within the United States to the gangs and cartels within the United States and going to Mexico or Latin America and beyond. And I look at the very solid measures of how can you stop this. So one thing is how do they acquire the guns? And there's 4 main measures they take to acquire firearms. The first is through straw purchases. So it's saying, oh, you got a clean record, you haven't got a felony, you go and buy the gun, and I'll give you $100 to go and buy a rifle for me, or I'll pay you $600 to buy 10 rifles for me, because there's no real consequences. And you see this, that people are consciously buying firearms for the cartels, and at the same time, they're getting probation, even though they know. So what they've done, in fact, in the new 2022 bipartisan Safer Communities Act, they had a clause there where they looked at increasing sentences for straw buyers. We've got to see if that's enforced. But basically, if people are consciously working with a drug cartel to go and buy the guns, that's something I think they should be getting jail time for. Hard to say. It's funny sometimes to say, lock them up. But sometimes when you're selling guns to somebody who are then using these to kill children, they think, well, there's got to be consequences. People shouldn't be doing that.
Of course.
The second thing is people are abusing what's known as the private sale loophole. So this is when basically you say, I'm a private collector, I've got some guns, and I'm going to sell a gun to you, and there's no paperwork involved.
Right.
But that's not really the case for some of these people. They're actually selling weapons. They're engaged in the business of selling weapons. So what they're really doing is they're buying a bunch of guns for a certain price, selling them for a markup, and selling them to people who deliberately cannot buy firearms because they haven't, they've done prison time. They don't want a paper trail. They're buying for the cartels. So this is allowing, again, trafficking of firearms to these organizations. And, one thing is to have universal background checks. So saying any gun sale, wherever it happens, you have a universal background check. And that's you've got the majority of Americans, the majority of conservatives, the majority of gun owners in favor of that. But even not quite going there, you can still see where you can try and hit and crack down on the people who are abusing that to be selling firearms without a license. Because if you're a licensed firearms dealer, you should ask for a background check. But if you're just a private collector, there's this kind of a loophole there. The third thing is you have people who are stealing guns, and you have, this simple thing, it's as simple as like videos of people who are going into gun stores, stealing guns, and they're not even in a locked place. So you're saying like you have to have laws about putting locks if you have guns being held. You have to have kind of decent security. People just can't just go and steal these things. And the fourth thing is the issue of ghost guns, or people who are buying parts off the internet and then assembling them, and saying, well, they should also be kind of considered as firearms. There, people kind of finding ways around, and again, the gun traffickers, the cartels are abusing those things. So it's kind of some quite simple, not really controversial things that could make a huge difference if there's a real effort to try and tackle this problem.
If we can have a real dialogue, absolutely. And so thank you for answering that question. I got so caught up in the moment, we didn't get a chance to address that. But you're going to be speaking at the World Affairs Council of Houston. You've done it before. This time, what will you be talking about? So yeah,
I'll be focusing on the firearms trafficking issue, but as well as that, I'll be talking about all of the up-to-date issues about cartels in Mexico. I'll be talking about the fentanyl. I'll be talking about the latest case about the Chapitos. And if there's a nice crowd, it's nice to have a frank conversation and tell some stories about what it's like on the ground there, what I see, and really what it's like working around as a journalist in these cartel areas in Mexico.
What are you hoping people will take away from this conversation and from this lecture, or these conversations and these lectures?
I mean, for me as a journalist, it's always about connecting to people and trying to raise their consciousness. I don't want to tell anybody what to think, but I can just say, I've spent 20 years around these cartels, talking to, in this case, gun traffickers, but talking to hitmen, talking to high-level cartel people, talking to military victims, all kinds of people, trying to make sense of this kind of crazy war that's been happening in Mexico and beyond, and just try and give people some more knowledge about that so they can make more informed decisions, or just have more knowledge about what's happening there.
Well, speaking of informed decisions, there was something you brought up earlier, not necessarily your own bias, but your awareness that you are a British person speaking about guns where they don't have guns in Britain. There's a huge knife problem, and you address that in your book, where a criminal kind of talks about they're completely different mediums, and it's almost the way that person argued. It's not the same kind of level of how do I even put it?
Well, I think it's an interesting case, and you see this brought up. Well, people will find a way to kill each other.
Yes.
And guns are only a tool. And there's a certain truth there, but there's limits to that. So if you look in the UK, in London, the murder level in London is, like less than 2 per 100,000. In some of the worst US cities, I mean, in places like Baltimore, you see regularly levels of like 40 per 100,000. So like 20 times that. Actually, you've seen some US cities even higher, reaching 80 per 100,000. And then in Mexico, in some of the worst areas, you see well over 100,000, 150 per 100,000, 150 per 100,000, and you get 200 plus. Where you've got these really, really high levels, it generally involves guns. There's a difference, and this is as some of these criminals, I talk to them about murdering with knives and murdering with guns, and so it's different. You get close to someone with a knife, you've got to get up there close and stab them, and you hear them. It's kind of, not everyone can do that. Whereas with guns, it's a lot easier to take a life
because it's so far away.
Yeah, when I've interviewed some of these guys who have killed like 30 people, and they got gun, they still, not everyone can kill with a gun. You have to have a certain nerve and a certain cold-bloodedness, but like, it's still like you sit there and it's like you've got distance, and it's like bang, you pull the trigger. This guy has a quote that it's too easy to kill with a gun, and it's too gangster. Said it's like what we this was actually somebody in Baltimore who had been convicted.
That's right, yeah.
And he was like, we kind of get sold this idea, and he kind of sees in movies, and we all kind of grow up and want to, shoot people, and we kind of had these ideas. So there's differences there. There's certainly differences there about the level of violence. And again, I don't tend that the United States can become the UK. You've got more than 400 million guns in the United States. It's not going to become like Europe. What Europe's done, and if you look at the shootings from terrorist shootings, which again is part of this, you get kind of crime, mass shootings, and terrorist incidents. You think the Bataclan massacre in Paris, where they had Kalashnikov style rifles. I went also to the factory in Serbia where one of these rifles was made that kind of disappeared in the black market and ended up there. And following those big shootings in France in like 2015, they cracked down on gun trafficking and illegal guns. And if you look at a lot of recent terror attacks in Europe, they've been something with knives and with cars and that kind of thing. And the number of casualties has been a lot less. There was a knife attack on London Bridge, and this guy ran up who was a former football hooligan, from Millwall, and he was like, oh, he ran up there and he got stabbed. He took a knife thing, but he managed to like pull this guy down. And that's very different, you know, when you look at some of these mass shootings where these people can take out 30, 35, 40 people, 50 people. So there's a difference with the power of these weapons. I mean, guns are tools, it's true. They can be used for good or bad, it's true, but they are powerful tools. You know, these are powerful tools. These are a tool that you can have there, and you can take somebody's life easily. Right. So they've got to be treated with a certain respect. And I think a lot of you know, gun owners, Second Amendment enthusiasts will appreciate that. You know, these are tools that you need respect for, you should really have training for, and that not everybody should have. Especially you should try and reduce the firepower of organizations which are openly extremely violent, like drug cartels.
Absolutely. Now, well, I'll make sure to have a link to the bottom of this article about the World Affairs Council of Houston in your lectures, but where else can people go to learn more about your work and what it is that you're doing?
Yeah, sure. So obviously buying my books is super appreciated. Blood, Gun, Money, Our Narco Gangster Warlords is the trilogy. And you can see those on, get those on Amazon. You can also get them directly from the publisher, which is Bloomsbury Press. You can follow me on Twitter. Funny name, but you can see it, Ioan Grillo, Grillo. So Ioan Grillo. You can see me on Twitter. You can see me on, look at my website, ioangrillo.com, or my Substack, which is also Ioan Grillo, Narco Politics, where I talk about all of these issues.
I love it. And my final question, perhaps the most serious, will you be coming back to Houston to see us again sometime?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I really appreciate with the World Affairs Council is I got to, you know, take some great food. So I had Texas barbecue, which is great. We went to some other kind of New Orleans style kind of place. That was fantastic. So one thing I always enjoy in Houston is, you know, you eat well in that city. I can definitely appreciate that, as well as having a good,
absolutely,
kind of pint of beer there as well.
Oh yeah. Well, is there anything else you want to add before we conclude?
I mean, you know, it's just the last word, I guess. It's kind of sad. I mean, my first book came out in 2011, and I'd spoken Houston for my first book coming out. I used to work for the Houston Chronicle as well, the newspaper, going back to the 2000s, and had a great history there with Houston Chronicle. But one of the things that's kind of sad was in 2011, I remember giving these first talks about drug cartels and saying, well, maybe we'll talk in 10 years time and this will be better. And sadly now it's 12 years time and it's worse. You know, more deaths in Mexico, more drug overdose in the United States. But we've got to hope in our 10 years and our 20 years. I mean, some point you got to hope there's going to be improvement in this situation. You don't see young people, especially, you know, it's real heartbreaking, young people, but anybody dying of this violence or drug overdoses on both sides of the border.
Oh yeah, prayers for them, and hopefully more people will take these words into consideration. Ioan Grillo, author and journalist, talking about his latest book, Blood, Gun, Money. This sticky notes are me actually reading it. It's electric. I'm not just saying that because the man is in front of me. Very well written, informative, and his book El Narco, highly encourage everybody to get it, check it out. It would make a nice Christmas present, as my former professor used to say. Ioan, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Great to be here. Thank you much.